In the summer of 2017, a 26-year-old man named Marcus Webb went camping alone in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. He had done solo trips before. He was comfortable in the wilderness. He knew what animals sounded like at night, and he knew how to stay calm when the forest got loud. He thought he knew everything that could possibly be out there. He was wrong. On his second night in the forest, Marcus woke up at 2:47 in the morning. He does not know what woke him. There was no sound, no movement, just a feeling. The kind that sits at the base of your skull and tells you, without words, without logic, that something has changed. That the air around you is different than it was when you closed your eyes. That you are no longer alone. He lay completely still inside his sleeping bag and stared at the roof of his tent. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself to go back to sleep. And then he heard it. Not footsteps. Not an animal moving through brush. Something else. Something that, to this day, Marcus Webb cannot describe with any confidence because he has never heard it before or since. He has said, in the account he posted online, in the interviews he gave afterward, in the conversations he has had with people who reached out to tell him they had heard the same thing in the same forest, that it was the sound of something breathing, slowly, deliberately, from directly outside his tent, less than 2 feet from his head. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He lay there for 4 hours until the sun came up and the breathing stopped. And when he finally unzipped his tent and stepped outside into the gray morning light and looked at the ground around his tent, he found something that he has not been able to stop thinking about in 8 years. Something that changed the way he sees the wilderness. Something that he wishes, more than almost anything, that he could explain. Stay with me. Welcome back to Dark Vault. I'm your host, and this is the place where we go into the stories that most people never hear about. Stories that got buried or dismissed or quietly filed away because the people involved could not prove what happened to them. Last week we talked about a hiker who vanished from the Cascade Mountains without leaving a single footprint. Tonight we are staying in the wilderness, but this story is different. This one has a survivor. And in some ways, that makes it harder. Because Marcus Webb has to live with what he experienced. He has to carry it with him every single day. And the question that he has never been able to answer, the question that this entire story turns on, is whether what was outside his tent that night was something that can be explained, or whether it was something that cannot. This story matters to me because it sits at a very specific intersection that I find endlessly compelling. The intersection between what we can verify and what we cannot. Between what experienced, rational, sober people report and what our current understanding of the natural world is able to account for. Marcus Webb is not a person who went looking for something strange. He was not on a ghost hunt. He was not trying to have a paranormal experience. He was a young man who wanted to spend a few days alone in the mountains and came home with a story that has followed him ever since. Those are the stories I trust most, the ones that nobody asked for. Marcus Webb grew up in Casper, Wyoming. He was the kind of child who spent more time outside than inside, in the hills behind his family's property, in the creeks, in the open country that most people in Wyoming grow up treating as their backyard. By his mid-20s, he was an experienced outdoorsman. He hunted, he fished, he had done solo camping trips in the Wind River Range, the Bighorn Mountains, and along the Beartooth Plateau. He understood wilderness the way people who have genuinely spent time in it understand it. Not as something romantic or theoretical, but as something real, physical, and governed by consistent rules. Things behave certain ways. Animals have patterns. The forest at night sounds a specific way, and if you have been in it enough times, you learn to read that sound the way you read weather. He chose Shoshone National Forest for his July 2017 trip for no particular reason other than that he had not been there before and wanted to explore new terrain. Shoshone is the oldest national forest in the United States, established in 1891. It covers approximately 2.5 million acres of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in northwestern Wyoming. Grizzly bears are present, mountain lions are present, wolves are present in the northern sections. Marcus knew this and was not concerned. He had camped in grizzly country before. He carried bear spray. He hung his food correctly. He was not careless. He drove to the trailhead on the morning of July 18th and hiked approximately 6 miles into his chosen campsite, a small clearing beside a tributary of the Shoshone River. He set up his tent, organized his gear, made dinner, watched the light go out of the sky, and went to sleep without incident. The first night was completely unremarkable. He slept well. He woke up to birdsong and morning light and spent the day exploring the area, fishing in the tributary, covering about 5 miles of terrain in a comfortable loop. He saw no other people. He saw a moose at the river in the afternoon. He was, by his own account, having one of the best solo trips of his life. He made camp again that evening, ate, watched the stars for a while, and got into his tent around 10:30. The night was still. Clear sky, temperature dropping into the low 50s, which is normal for the elevation in July. He was in a good sleeping bag, comfortable. He had no reason to expect anything other than another solid night of sleep. He closed his eyes and was asleep within minutes. He woke up at 2:47 in the morning. He knows the time because his watch was on his wrist and he checked it instinctively, the way most people do when they wake up unexpectedly in the night. He does not know what woke him. There was no noise, there was no physical disturbance. Nothing had touched the tent, nothing had made a sudden sound. He has described the experience of waking as being less like being startled and more like being summoned, as if something had reached into his sleep and pulled him out of it, as if his body had decided on some level below conscious thought that he needed to be awake. He lay on his back in the dark and listened. He has said that the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not normal nighttime quiet. The Shoshone is never fully silent. There is always the sound of wind in the trees, insects, the river in the distance, the small sounds of the forest doing what forests do at night. But at 2:47 on the morning of July 19th, none of those sounds were present. It was as if the entire forest had paused, as if every living thing within earshot had decided, at the same moment, to stop moving and stop making any noise whatsoever. Marcus lay still and waited. He told himself it was a predator. He told himself a mountain lion or a grizzly had moved into the area and the forest had gone quiet in response, the way it does when a large predator is nearby. This is a real phenomenon. Prey animals genuinely do go silent when a significant threat is in the area. It was a rational explanation, and he held on to it. He controlled his breathing. He stayed very still. He waited for the silence to end and for the forest to pick up again the way it does after a false alarm. That is when the breathing started. It was slow, measured, the rhythm of something large breathing with total deliberateness from directly outside the left wall of his tent, less than 2 feet from his face. Marcus has described the sound in multiple accounts, and the description is consistent every time. It was not fast or excited, the way an animal's breathing tends to be when it is investigating something. It was slow, patient, the breathing of something that was in no hurry, the breathing of something that was not alarmed, the breathing of something that was aware of him and was not afraid. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not reach for his bear spray, which was on his right side, because he was afraid that any movement would provoke whatever was out there. He simply lay there and listened. And what he has said in every account since is that the thing that frightened him most was not the sound itself. It was the quality of it, the slowness, the deliberateness, the sense, which he acknowledges is not something he can prove or quantify, that what was outside his tent was not investigating him randomly, that it knew exactly what was in the tent and was choosing to stay. The breathing continued for what Marcus estimates was somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. He did not look at his watch during this period because he was afraid to move his arm. He kept his eyes on the ceiling of the tent and his body completely motionless. At some point, he cannot identify exactly when, the breathing stopped. Not gradually, not fading away as something moved off. It simply stopped. One breath, and then silence, as if a switch had been thrown. The forest sounds did not return immediately. Marcus lay in the same position for what he believes was another 20 to 30 minutes, listening to nothing. Then, slowly, the insects came back. A night bird called somewhere in the distance. The river became audible again. The forest restarted. And Marcus Webb lay in his tent until 5:30 in the morning, when the sky began to lighten. And then he waited another hour after that before he finally unzipped his tent and stepped outside. He found 3 things. The first was the ground immediately around the left side of his tent. He had set up on a patch of soft earth near the riverbank, and the ground around the tent had retained a light impression of moisture from the previous day's dew. On the right side of the tent, where he had walked when setting up, his own boot prints were clearly visible. On the left side, where the breathing had come from, the ground was marked, not with a clear, definable print, with a depression. A large, irregular compression of the earth that suggested something heavy had been standing or crouching there for an extended period. Something heavy enough and present long enough to compress the soft ground noticeably. The compression measured approximately 2.5 feet across. There was no claw mark, no defined toe or heel shape, just a broad, deep impression in the soft earth directly beside where his head had been as he slept. The second thing he found was the silence. Not the silence of the night, that had ended, but the absence of wildlife sign in the immediate area. No tracks of the small animals that typically move at night in the forest floor detritus. No disturbance of the leaf litter by deer or elk. The area directly around his campsite, in a rough circle of perhaps 40 feet in all directions, was strangely undisturbed, as if nothing had wanted to come close. The third thing he found was subtler, and it is the detail that has drawn the most attention from the people who have read his account over the years. On the exterior surface of his tent, at roughly the height where the breathing had sounded, approximately 18 inches from the ground, there was a series of what he can only describe as smudges. Long, narrow impressions in the fabric of the tent wall, as if something had been pressed against it from outside. Not cuts, not punctures, just pressure marks. The shape and spacing of them were, Marcus has said, not consistent with any animal paw or claw pattern he has ever seen or been able to identify. Marcus Webb did not stay another night. He broke camp that morning, packed everything, and hiked the 6 miles back to the trailhead. He did not report what had happened to anyone in an official capacity, because he did not know what to report, or who to report it to. He drove home to Casper and spent several days trying to construct a rational explanation for what he had experienced. He considered bears first. Grizzlies are present in Shoshone, and a grizzly investigating a campsite is not unusual. But the breathing pattern was not consistent with what he knew of grizzly behavior around tents. Grizzlies investigating a scent source are typically less patient. They move, they sniff actively. They make the tent fabric move with their proximity. And the ground compression did not match a grizzly. He has looked at wildlife track references extensively in the years since. A grizzly standing beside a tent would leave a very specific paw impression pattern. What was in the ground beside his tent was not that pattern. He considered mountain lions. Mountain lions are ambush predators with extraordinary patience. They can hold a position for a very long time. The breathing pattern, slow, deliberate, patient, is more consistent with feline behavior than ursine, but the ground compression was too large and too formless for a mountain lion, and the smudges on the tent fabric were not consistent with cat anatomy. Mountain lion encounters with tents in the literature almost invariably involve the cat making contact with the tent in a way that is more sudden and more dramatic. What Marcus described was something that pressed itself against the fabric slowly and deliberately, and held that pressure. He eliminated wolves based on size. A wolf pack investigation of a tent produces multiple sets of tracks and typically involves more vocal behavior. He eliminated elk and moose based on behavior and anatomy. He went through every large animal in the regional fauna and found something that did not satisfy him. An explanation that covered all the details: the size of the compression, the breathing pattern, the duration, the smudges, the way the forest went completely silent and then came back. He could not find one. Marcus posted his account online approximately 3 months after it happened on a forum dedicated to wilderness experiences. He was specific about the location, the dates, and the details. He did not claim to know what it was. He said very plainly that he had experienced something he could not explain and was posting it in case anyone had encountered something similar in the same area. The response surprised him. Within 48 hours, he had received over 200 replies. The majority were skeptical in the way internet forums tend to be, suggesting bears, suggesting he had been half asleep and misheard normal animal sounds, suggesting the compression in the earth had been caused by his own movements around the tent before he went to sleep. He had expected this and had addressed each of those possibilities in the original post. But approximately 30 of the responses were different. They were from people who had camped in Shoshone National Forest, some within a mile of his campsite coordinates, some in the broader region, who described experiences that were structurally similar. Not identical, but similar in ways that Marcus found genuinely difficult to dismiss. Multiple accounts described waking in the night to a total silence of the kind Marcus described, the sudden absolute absence of all wildlife sound that lasted for a defined period and then returned. Several described a breathing sound from outside the tent that did not match known animal behavior patterns. 2 accounts described similar ground compressions the following morning. One account, from a man who had camped in the same area 7 years earlier in 2010, described finding smudge marks on the exterior of his tent that he had dismissed at the time as artifact of the tent fabric pressing against brush. He had never made a connection between those marks and anything else until he read Marcus's post. None of these people had reported their experiences officially. Most of them had, like Marcus, constructed working explanations that they acknowledged to themselves were insufficient, but that allowed them to move on with their lives. One of the respondents, a woman who had been camping with her husband in the area in 2014, said something that has stayed with me since I first read this account. She wrote, "I did not talk about this because I knew that the moment I did, people would tell me what it was. And I have never been convinced that anyone knows what it was. And living in the uncertainty is more honest than living in the false comfort of an explanation that does not actually fit." I have read a lot of wilderness encounter accounts in the research I do for this channel. I have become over time fairly good at identifying the ones that feel constructed, the ones where the details accumulate in a way that feels designed rather than experienced. Marcus Webb's account does not feel that way to me. And the cluster of corroborating accounts from the same geographic area, posted by people who had no connection to each other and no apparent reason to fabricate, adds a layer to this story that I find genuinely difficult to set aside. There are a number of documented phenomena that researchers who study wilderness anomalies have proposed as potential explanations for experiences like Marcus's. I want to walk through them honestly, the same way I walk through all of these cases, not to endorse any particular explanation, but to give the fullest possible picture of what is known. Infrasound is one of the more compelling scientific explanations for certain wilderness experiences. Infrasound is sound below the threshold of human hearing, below 20 Hz. It is produced by a variety of natural sources: wind moving over certain geological formations, large waterfalls, the movement of large animals. Research has demonstrated that infrasound in certain frequency ranges can produce measurable physiological responses in humans, including a feeling of unease, a sense of presence, accelerated heart rate, and in some cases, auditory and visual disturbances. Some researchers have proposed that unusual geological features in certain wilderness areas produce infrasound that could account for some of the experiences people report. The Shoshone National Forest sits in an area of significant geological complexity. Volcanic history, active hydrothermal features in adjacent Yellowstone, complex river topography. It is not impossible that certain locations within the forest produce infrasound in ranges that affect human physiology. But infrasound does not produce ground compressions. It does not produce pressure marks on tent fabric, and it does not produce localized directional breathing sounds. Infrasound is a diffuse phenomenon, not a directional one. So while it may be a partial contributor to the quality of the experience, the feeling of being watched, the heightened fear response, it does not account for the physical evidence that Marcus found the following morning. The scientific literature on undocumented large primate species in North America is essentially non-existent in peer-reviewed form. That is a fact, and it matters. What is also a fact is that the North American wilderness is incompletely surveyed. that new large animal species have been documented in the past century in regions considered well explored, and that the volume of consistent, geographically clustered, structurally similar accounts from sober, experienced outdoors people in certain wilderness areas is a phenomenon that deserves more serious scientific attention than it has received. I am not telling you that Bigfoot is real. I am telling you that the dismissal of experiences like Marcus Webb's as straightforwardly explicable is itself a form of intellectual dishonesty that I am not comfortable with. What I know for certain is this: Marcus Webb went into the Shoshone National Forest in July 2017 as an experienced, rational, capable outdoorsman who had spent years in the wilderness without encountering anything he could not explain. He came out 8 years ago with an experience that he has not been able to explain since. He has not been back to that specific area. He still camps, he still loves the wilderness, but he has said in subsequent interviews that something changed for him that night. Not his love of wild places, but his certainty about what is in them. His confidence that he knows the full inventory of what shares the dark with him when he is alone in the trees. I think about that woman's comment, the one who said that living in the uncertainty is more honest than living in the false comfort of an explanation that does not actually fit. I have been thinking about it since I first read it months ago when I started researching this story, because it gets at something that I think is true about the world and true about the kinds of stories this channel covers. We are very good as a species at closing open questions, at finding the nearest available explanation and applying it, even when it is slightly the wrong shape, because the alternative, holding the question open, sitting with the uncertainty, admitting that we do not know, is genuinely uncomfortable in a way that most people find unbearable. The human brain is a pattern completion machine. It does not like gaps. It will fill them with whatever is closest to hand, whether or not the fill is accurate. But the wilderness is full of gaps. It is vast in a way that it is very hard to hold in your mind when you are in a city or a suburb or anywhere that human infrastructure makes the world feel managed and known and accounted for. The Shoshone National Forest alone covers 2.5 million acres. 2.5 million acres of terrain that is, at any given moment, almost entirely unobserved by any human being. Whatever is in those acres is in them on its own terms, doing whatever it does, living whatever life it lives, without our knowledge or our classification. And on a night in July 2017, some part of whatever lives in that forest chose to stop beside a small tent on the bank of a river tributary and breathe for 20 to 30 minutes in the darkness beside the head of a sleeping man. Marcus Webb heard it. He lay still, and he listened, and he survived it, which is the most important thing. He drove home to Casper and he went about his life. He raised questions online and found people who had heard something like it in the same place, which did not answer the question, but at least confirmed that he was not alone in asking it. And he has carried this story for 8 years now, not as a trauma exactly, but as a persistent, unresolved piece of information about the world that he cannot file away because there is no file for it. I do not have a file for it either. What I have is the account. What I have is the ground compression and the pressure marks and the forest that went silent and then came back. What I have is 30 independent reports from the same region describing similar experiences. And what I have is the honest acknowledgement that none of the explanations I have examined fully accounts for all of those details simultaneously. The Shoshone National Forest is open right now. People are in it tonight. Hikers and fishermen and families in tents and solo adventurers who love the wilderness the way Marcus Webb loves it. Seriously, knowledgeably, with real respect for what it is. Most of them will sleep undisturbed and wake up to birdsong and morning light, and have exactly the experience they went out there to have. I genuinely hope that is true for every single one of them. But if you are ever in that forest on a summer night, and you wake up at 2:47 in the morning for no reason you can identify, and the forest is quieter than a forest has any right to be, do not move. Lie still, control your breathing, and try to remember what that woman wrote years after her own night in those trees. That living in the uncertainty is more honest than living in the false comfort of an explanation that does not actually fit. Because whatever was outside Marcus Webb's tent that night, It did not need an explanation. It knew exactly what it was. The question has always been ours. That is the story of Marcus Webb and the night something watched him sleep in the Shoshone National Forest. If you are watching this and you have had an experience in a wild place that you have never been able to explain, something you heard, something you found, something that changed the way you understand what is out there, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and stories like Marcus's almost always come to me through people who have been carrying their own version of them for years. New video goes up every week right here on Dark Vault. If you are not subscribed yet, do that now, because next week's story comes from inside a house, and it is worse than the forest, in every possible way. Until then, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, the wilderness does not tell you everything that is in it. It never has. It never will.